For the past 6 years, Ian has been our world. My wife's pregnancy with him wasn't easy. There were a number of scares and close calls due to health issues she suffered from most of her life. Every doctor she had been to had told her that she would never be able to get pregnant, let alone carry a baby to term. She put on a brave face and joked that she would get an entire litter of puppies instead, but on quiet nights when she didn't know that I was watching her, she let her real feelings show in her face. She loved children, and the thought of not being able to have one herself was heartbreaking for her. It would have been one thing if we had discussed the possibility and came to the conclusion ourselves that having a child wasn't something that we wanted. Having the choice taken completely out of your hands, though, that's different. Maybe it shouldn't feel that way, but it does. We discussed other options, of course. Adoption, fostering, you name it, we looked into it. We even had a meeting scheduled with an adoption agency when what can only be described as a miracle happened. That miracle was Ian. Against all the odds that had been stacked high against us, Ellen became pregnant. Her doctors were at a complete loss. It should have been impossible, but suddenly there we were, talking about converting our second bedroom into a nursery and planning out how to shuffle around our work schedules. Complications began about 4 months into the pregnancy. It seemed like every few weeks we were at the hospital while the staff poked and prodded her as they ran their tests. Ellen was incredible during all of it. I was acting like a complete lunatic, worried out of my damn mind about every little thing, but she would just lay there in the uncomfortable hospital bed, stroking her increasingly large belly and smiling to herself. She would tell me that she just knew that everything would work out in the end. All the things that were happening were just bumps in the road. She went into labor early, just a few days after the 31-week mark. She waddled into the kitchen and told me, in a very calm and very matter-of-fact tone, that her water had broken. I had been getting ready for bed, so in that same collected manner, she retrieved both the bag we had packed weeks earlier and the car keys as I frantically got dressed and grabbed a few necessary items that hadn't been put into the bag yet. 6 hours later, Ian was born. He was so small, and I could feel my heart sink as he emerged. The doctor immediately took him over to a radiant warming table where he and a nurse began working with him. A second nurse kept me from getting too close to ensure that I didn't get into the way. The activity suddenly stopped, and the most wonderful sound filled the room. Our son was crying. The doctor informed me that, due to Ian's size, he would need to spend a few weeks in the newborn intensive care unit. From what he could see, however, the baby would be fine. I remember feeling so relieved that I had to put a hand on the bed's footboard to steady myself. My fingers had just touched the plastic when the alarm on Ellen's monitor went off. The stress of the labor and birth had been too much for her body, and she had suffered massive hemorrhaging. There was a flurry of activity as a group of medical staff rushed over to work on her while, at the same time, Ian was taken out of the room. In that exact moment, I was at a complete loss as to what to do. Was I supposed to stay with Ellen while she fought for her life, or go with our newborn child to make sure that he wasn't alone? A nurse, an older woman with kind eyes peering out over her mask, made the decision for me. She took me by the arm and led me out of the room, speaking quiet and gentle words that I wasn't capable of processing at the time. She walked with me all the way to the NICU and sat me down in a chair next to the incubator that Ian had been placed in. Before she left, she promised to let me know the moment there was any word on Ellen. I sat there for hours, staring at the tiny little person that we had brought into this world. He slept for the majority of that time, his chest rising and falling as his mouth opened and closed. A tube had been placed in his nose to help with his breathing, but he didn't seem to notice it. I wondered what babies dreamed of, or even if they dreamed at all. When the nurse finally returned, she had removed her mask and had a serious expression on her face. I immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario, but she quickly assured me that Ellen had pulled through and that she was currently recovering. The damage had been severe, however, and to save her life, the doctors had needed to perform an emergency hysterectomy. Whatever miracle had happened to bring Ian to our lives would not be able to happen again. I didn't care. All that mattered was that the two people I cared about the most in the world were going to be all right. The stress and fear all came collapsing in on me, and I sat back in my chair and wept. I had been so close to losing everything. A few weeks later, we were able to take Ian home. It felt like our little family was finally complete. At least it did to me. Ellen was convinced that there was still one thing missing. She wanted a dog. I didn't come around to the idea overnight. I felt like having a new child in the house was stressful enough without adding a puppy into the mix. She kept pressing me, though, telling me how wonderful it would be to have the baby and dog grow up together. They would be best friends from the very beginning, she assured me. And besides, it would make her feel safer when she was home alone with Ian. I eventually relented. I always had a hard time saying no to her in the first place, and she was so fixated on getting a dog that I knew that I'd never win. Eventually, I told her that if it really meant that much to her, I was okay with it, but to at least not get a large dog. She technically listened to me, as she didn't get a large dog. She got the largest dog she could find. A month after we brought Ian home, we had a Great Dane puppy named Mavis running around the house, sniffing and licking everything. Just as Ellen had predicted, Mavis and Ian immediately loved each other. It won't be news to any parent that raising a small child is difficult. Simply finding the time to do everything that needs to be done is extremely hard, if not impossible. I worked long hours in the next city over, and Ellen ran an online business that ran the risk of falling apart if she didn't devote enough time to it each day. When Ellen's mother Violet offered to assist with the baby while we worked, we immediately jumped at the idea. She moved in with us not long after we got Mavis. A few years prior, her husband had passed away from throat cancer, and the house they had shared was too big for a single person. Besides, she reminded us, it gave her an excuse to be around the new baby all the time. There was something else that factored into the decision as well. Shortly after Ian's birth, Ellen had fallen into postpartum depression. While she had gotten over that within a couple of weeks, she still suffered from bouts of severe depression every so often. She tried to explain it to me once. It wasn't that she wasn't happy. It was more of a general feeling of malaise and exhaustion. I'll admit that I didn't understand it completely, but that didn't stop me from worrying. She went to a number of doctors, and she was eventually given a prescription that at least helped take the edge off. She really hated taking it, however. She said that they made her groggy, and that she had a hard time focusing on anything when she was using it. Because of this, she only took it when absolutely necessary. For nearly 6 years, our little family was a happy one. Ian grew like a weed, and it seemed like every time I turned around, he had put in a few more inches. We fell into a routine where Violet would watch him during the day while Ellen and I worked, and our evenings were spent together as a family. It was an overall simple life, but also a very enjoyable one. 4 months ago, we lost Violet. It was very sudden, as she hadn't had any health conditions that we were aware of. One night she went up to bed, and the next day she simply didn't wake up. It was a tough loss for all of us, but Ian took it especially hard. He had been incredibly close to his grandmother, and no longer having her there was both confusing and heartbreaking. At first he didn't understand what was happening. Ellen and I explained it to him as best as we could, but he would still ask us multiple times a day when Granny was going to come home. When he eventually worked out that she wasn't coming back, it devastated him. He would collapse into tears at seemingly random times, and we would find him quietly crying in odd places around the house, Mavis's head in his lap. He also developed a difficulty sleeping through the night, something that had never been a problem with him before. Violet being gone meant that we needed to come up with a new plan for taking care of Ian. After a long conversation with the owner of the company that I worked for, I left the position that I had been employed in for over a decade to take a different job. It paid less, but it allowed me to work from home. As Ellen already worked from her home office, we were able to work together to make sure that our son was cared for. It took a while, but we managed to settle into this new routine. Although I certainly didn't like the circumstances that had brought us to this point, I found myself enjoying the extra time that I got to spend with Ian. My old job had required working long hours, while my current one had me completely finished before dinner. We'd all eat together before spending an hour running around outside if the weather was nice, or playing inside if it wasn't. After that, I'd give him his bath, and then it was time for him to lay down to go to sleep. In theory, the routine was supposed to end around 8 o'clock each night, but if you have kids, you know that no routine is foolproof. Ian responded about as well as could be expected to the changes. He continued to have difficulty processing Violet's death, and he was quieter and more moody than he had been before, but as fall turned to winter, he seemed to at least start to climb out of his sadness. The closer Christmas got, the more he smiled and got into the holiday spirit. 2 weeks before Christmas, I made an egregious mistake. It was one of those decisions that I knew was bad at the time that I was making it, and part of me was screaming at me that I was being an idiot. I still went ahead with it anyway. I don't make those kinds of mistakes often. When I do, though, they come back to bite me every single time. A friend of mine came to me with a request. He was the manager of the only local mall within 30 miles that was still operating. While there weren't many stores that remained open there, the one time that things got busy was around Christmas. There's something about the holiday season that makes people want to walk into a big open building so that they can rummage around in small claustrophobic stores, I guess. It's the only time of year that the various retailers that lease store space manage to make more than a minuscule profit. Starting in the middle of November, the mall was decorated with all the usual holiday cheer. I have fond memories as a kid walking under giant wreaths and ornaments hanging from the ceiling, and Ellen and I took Ian there so that I could see the same look in his eyes that I must have had at his age. He listened to the Christmas music playing throughout the building and stared with a big smile on his face at the lights of every color that adorned the walls. The big centerpiece to every mall at Christmas time was, of course, Santa Claus. There was a spot in the center of the building that was decorated to look like a workshop in a winter wonderland. In the middle of everything sat Santa on his big red chair. Ian was both mesmerized and intimidated by him. There was the big guy himself, ready to take a picture with him and ask him what he wanted for Christmas. That was a lot of pressure for a kid his age. It wasn't really Santa, obviously. It was some guy that had been hired to play the part. I think all children know that, or at least suspect it deep down inside. It weirdly doesn't matter though, does it? It's still an important moment. While we were waiting in line, my friend, both the mall manager and an acquaintance of mine since grade school, came up to me and asked if he could speak with me. I had seen him a few days prior at a gas station, and we had caught up for a few minutes before going our separate ways. Curious, I told Ellen and Ian that I would be right back and followed him to a nearby quiet spot. He explained that the man currently sitting in the Santa chair had told him earlier that day that there was a family emergency on the other side of the country, and that he needed to catch a flight later that night. My friend hadn't been able to find a replacement, and he's hoping that, since I had told him at the gas station that I was on vacation for the holidays, I would be able to help him out. I heard him out, but I also politely turned him down. Putting aside the fact that the pay he was offering was terrible, it just wasn't something that I was interested in doing. I worked hard throughout the year, and all that I wanted to do on my vacation was to relax and enjoy the time with my family. When I returned to the line, I explained to Ellen what had happened. She was completely on board with my position. I happened to mention that the job came with a significant discount at the stores in the mall, however, and she suddenly changed her position. Ian was growing so quickly that much of his clothing no longer fit properly. There was also furniture that needed to be replaced now that Mavis was completely out of her chewing everything phase. With the discount and additional pay, we'd be able to get those things ahead of schedule. That was how my much anticipated and much needed vacation turned into an endless stream of small children and stressed parents. If I'm being honest, it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. It was a real delight to bring happiness to those kids, and there were only a few times that the line had more than a few people in it. Ellen and Ian visited during all of my shifts, and after I had explained to him that I was just being Santa's helper, so it was okay for me to dress up like that, he had a lot of fun running around and playing inside the small house that was part of the set. On Christmas Eve, there were a few hours early in the day that the line seemed like it would never end, but as the final hour of my final shift as Santa began, the majority of the mall was empty. The few last-minute shoppers that were present were all older and weren't interested in speaking with a man dressed in a fake beard and red suit. The heavy snow that had been falling since noon wasn't helping with the foot traffic either. Ellen and I were standing at the entrance to the Santa's Village display, drinking hot chocolate while Ian sat in the throne-like chair with my Santa coat draped over him like a blanket. There was a small play area for children on the other side of the mall, and he had exhausted himself running around inside of it like a maniac. Just as I took a sip from my drink, Ian cried out in surprise from behind us. We both immediately turned towards him and hurried over to the chair. He was thrashing around inside the coat. It took a few seconds for us to untangle him while we tried to figure out what was wrong. My first instinct was that he had fallen asleep and had a bad dream. As we got the coat away from his face, though, I saw that there were 3 long scratches on the side of it. They weren't deep, but they penetrated just far enough for small beads of blood to well up along them. Ellen examined them as closely as she could through his tears before smiling at him and declaring that the scratches weren't bad at all. They just needed to be cleaned up a little. Quickly flipping the small sign at the front of Santa's Village to closed, I led the way to the hallways containing the staff offices. At the end of the corridor was a private bathroom, and I ducked inside to retrieve the small first aid kit that I had seen inside about a week prior. Ellen handed Ian over to me so that she could search the kit for what she needed. I sat down on a bench with him and rocked him slowly. It took about 15 minutes, but Ellen managed to clean the scratches and apply antiseptic to them. As he got over the initial shock, Ian calmed down and put on a brave face while she worked. He winced a bit as the antiseptic was put on, but otherwise he got through the process without incident. Once she was finished, we walked slowly back towards Santa's Village, trying to figure out what exactly had happened. At first we thought that he had scratched himself in his sleep, but he quickly shook his head and rejected the idea. Instead, he looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Daddy, Nighty Night hurt me." We both looked at him in confusion. I don't know what I expected him to say, but it certainly wasn't that. "Nighty Night?" Ellen asked softly. "Like what Daddy and I tell you before you go to sleep at night?" "Nighty Night," Ian repeated, more forcefully this time. "He scratched me, like the bad cat did." Just after his 3rd birthday, he had been scratched by a neighbor's kitten while trying to play with it. The claws hadn't even punctured his skin, but the shock of the pain had stuck with him. "I'm sorry, big guy, we don't understand," I told him. "Are you saying that Nighty Night is a cat?" "No cat. Nighty Night is a monster." I looked back down at the scratches and then at Ellen. Something had obviously happened, but just as obviously, it hadn't been a monster. I never thought for a second that Ian was lying to us. He was prone to the occasional fib just like any young child was, but he never lied to us about important things. He was also too scared to be making up a story. We arrived back at Santa's Village. Giving Ian back to Ellen, I walked down the small path leading to the chair. It was possible that the Santa coat buttons had caused the scratches, or maybe there was something sharp inside the lining that I hadn't noticed. It was draped over the seat of the chair. I paused. I would have sworn that it had been thrown on the ground after we took it off of Ian. Reaching out, I picked up the coat. To my surprise, there was something underneath it. It was a small black hardcover book. The cover was made of leather, and stamped into it was an intricate design of entwined vines and leaves. A folded piece of paper was sitting on top of it. After a brief hesitation, I took it and unfolded it. "A holiday gift," the note said in exquisite calligraphy. I felt a chill go through me. I turned the paper over, but there wasn't anything else written on it. My eyes went down to the book still sitting on the chair. With the note no longer on top of it, I could see the title written in gold lettering on the black leather. Nighty Night. I glanced back over at Ellen and Ian. She was kneeling down in front of him with her back turned towards me, saying something that I couldn't hear. He was looking over her shoulder directly at me, and our eyes locked. There was a look of worry on his face. Not sure what else to do, I reached towards the book. My fingers stopped less than an inch away from it. I didn't want to touch it. Something in the back of my head was screaming at me to just walk away. I glanced towards Ian again and saw the fresh scratches on his face. Setting my jaw, picked up the book and opened it. It was designed like a children's book, with short phrases and pictures on each page. The pictures were dark and disturbing, however, and the words looked like they had been scratched onto the parchment-like paper. I began to read, slowly taking in each page before moving on to the next. In the place between waking and sleep, it's in that moment that I creep. As the child grows still for winter's rest, I enter your world, an uninvited guest. Sadness and despair are what I seek, feelings that turn the strong into the weak. There's no finer wine to consume than a child's despair and gloom. But if happiness comes and I cannot be fed, I feast on the pain and terror instead. When the child's life no longer burns bright, then you will be free of Nighty Night. Almost before I was finished reading the last word, the book broke apart. As I stared at it in complete incomprehension, the leather and paper crumbled into pieces before falling to the ground. As the pieces made contact with the hard flooring, they turned to dust. A terrible smell, the smell of decay and rot, filled the air. I stood over the dust with my hand still outstretched until Ellen's voice shook me from my stupor. She was calling for me and asking if everything was okay. I turned towards her slowly and had absolutely no idea how to answer that question. I tried to explain to her what had just happened. Whispering so that Ian couldn't hear, I told her about the book that I had found, its contents, and how it had disintegrated after I'd finished reading it. I also showed her the pile of dust that was still on the floor. I don't think that she really believed me. Hell, I wasn't sure if I believed me. It was all so far-fetched and crazy, and it was easy to believe that my imagination had played tricks on me, or that stress and exhaustion had finally caught up to me. Much had been the case earlier with Ian. Ellen didn't think that I was lying. She knew that I wouldn't do that, especially about something like this. It was more that she thought I was so tired that I momentarily dozed off on my feet. There were still 15 minutes on my final shift as Santa, but I made the executive decision to close up shop early. Between what had happened to Ian and whatever had actually taken place when I returned to the chair, I felt that it was warranted. Besides, the mall was completely empty at this point. The stores had all closed, and I could just make out the lone security guard locking doors at the far side of the building. We all bundled up and went out into the parking lot. The snow was coming down so hard that it was difficult to see our car before we were right on top of it. While Ellen got Ian bundled into his seat and started the car, I went through the long and difficult task of scraping snow and ice off of the windows. Accumulated snow was very heavy, and by the time I was halfway finished with the task, I was feeling tired and winded. I stopped scraping as I heard a noise to my left. It sounded like a foot crunching down into the slush covering the parking lot. I turned towards it. The visibility was low, and I couldn't see more than a few yards, but there didn't seem to be anyone there. Still, I had the strange feeling that there was something there, unseen, but watching. I shook my head to clear it and continued the scraping, chiding myself for jumping at shadows. I did move faster than I had before, however. I eventually finished, and we got on the road. The streets were mostly empty, but with the snow, I was still forced to drive slowly. The traffic lights were difficult to see until I was right up on them. There were more than a few moments where the tires lost their traction. I gritted my teeth and drove as safely as possible. The Christmas lights that had been hung up by the city and local businesses looked odd through the snow and darkness. The various colors appeared in streaks rather than round bulb-shaped orbs. It was like I was driving through a funhouse tunnel. Normally the drive from the mall to our house took less than 15 minutes. Because of the weather conditions, it took over an hour. It was with more than a little relief that I pulled the car into the driveway and we hurried inside. Mavis was there to greet us at the door, just like always. She danced around wagging her tail while her ears flopped around, begging for love and attention. Ellen distracted her while I helped Ian get out of his snowsuit. As I was removing his boots, Ellen snapped her fingers to get my attention. I looked towards her and found that Mavis had stopped acting excited and was instead staring at the front door. Her ears were pulled back, and she was trembling. Something was making her nervous. After a minute or two, she calmed down and went back to her normal happy self. The rest of the evening was relaxing and uneventful. We had dinner, and afterwards Ian convinced Ellen and I to let him stay up to watch one of his favorite Christmas specials. He and Mavis laid down together underneath the tree, his eyes fixated on the screen, and her eyes closed as she snored loudly. When the show was over and we put him to bed, he looked like he would pass out almost immediately. I kissed him on the forehead and left the bedroom, waiting in the hallway with Mavis while Ellen took her turn doing the same. As my wife closed the door, we went back downstairs while the dog laid down in her usual position next to his bedroom. After waiting a few minutes, Ellen snuck out of the garage and retrieved a stack of presents and wrapping paper. It seemed like every year we waited until the very last minute to wrap presents for Christmas, and she was determined not to make that mistake again. She sat down on the floor and went to work while I idly searched for something to watch. It wasn't that I didn't want to help her with the wrapping, it's that she didn't allow me to. Every time I tried to wrap a present, it would come out looking awful no matter how much effort I put into it. I was lazily flipping through channels when I heard Mavis growling upstairs. At first I didn't recognize the sound, mistaking it for the buzzing that the upstairs hallway vent sometimes made. As it continued, though, I realized that something had the dog riled. Leaving Ellen to her wrapping, I climbed the stairs leading up to the upstairs hallway and was immediately struck by an unpleasant smell. It only lingered for a moment, but it was unmistakably the same scent of rot that I had smelled back at the mall. It was gone so fast that I couldn't be sure that it had actually been there. Mavis was standing up, and her teeth were bared. The growling I had heard was coming from the back of her throat. Every few seconds she would stop long enough to smell the air before going back to growling. She was looking away from me, and when I put my hand on her back, she visibly jumped. Turning around, she looked up at me for a long moment before shaking her head and pushing her head into my hand in an effort to get me to scratch behind her ears. Whatever had freaked her out had either passed or never been there in the first place. Feeling unsettled, I opened Ian's bedroom door, doing so slowly to be as quiet as possible. I peered into the dark room and gave my eyes a few seconds to adjust. Ian was passed out and snoring, one leg hanging over the side of his bed. I closed the door again and turned around to head back downstairs. Mavis was now pressed against the wall opposite the bedroom door. She was in a sitting position, but her entire body was shoved back and touching the wall. She was visibly shaking. Her eyes were locked on the door I had just closed. A sudden panic overtook me. I grabbed the doorknob and practically flung the door open again. As the door swung, I caught sight of a figure in the room. It was huge, so tall that it had to bend over so that its head didn't touch the ceiling. It was gone so quickly that I couldn't make out any other details before it had vanished completely. It was like the passage of the edge of the door wiped it away as it moved. I stood in the doorway with my eyes wide open, scanning the room for any sign of the figure. There was nothing. I didn't realize that I was holding my breath until my lungs started to burn. I released the air and nearly choked as I took in more. "Daddy?" Ian called out in a slurred voice as he stirred in his bed. I jumped in surprise, and I heard Mavis's collar tags clank together as she did the same. "Yeah, it's me, big guy," I answered in the most reassuring voice that I could muster. "Everything is okay. You're okay." "Can I sleep in your and Mommy's bed?" I frowned. When he was younger, Ian used to climb into bed with Ellen and I on an almost nightly basis. We were never quite sure if it was because he was afraid of being alone in his room or for some other reason. Whatever the case, he had eventually grown out of it, and he hadn't asked to sleep in our bed in quite some time. Normally, I would have said no. I wouldn't have wanted him to backslide into old habits. On this particular night, however, the thought of leaving him alone made my blood run cold. "I'll tell you what," I replied slowly. "Why don't you come downstairs with us for a while?" I jerked slightly as I felt a hand on my arm. Turning, I found Ellen standing next to me. She quietly reminded me that there were unwrapped presents downstairs. After a moment's discussion, she told Ian that he could come with her into our bedroom and lay with her for a while. Scooping him up into her arms, she gave me a quick kiss on the cheek as she headed towards our room with him. "Ian?" I asked as she opened our bedroom door, a question coming to mind. "What were you doing when you got scratched back at the mall?" "I don't know," he replied sleepily. "I was thinking about Grandma, then I got tired, and then Nighty scratched me." Ellen shot me a disapproving look as she closed the door behind them. I understood what thoughts were behind that look. She was trying to get him to sleep, and I was bringing up something that had scared him earlier in the day. I wouldn't have asked if part of me didn't think it was important. Sadness and despair are what I seek. The words came into my mind as if by their own accord, and I shivered. I went back downstairs. As I did so, Mavis followed close behind. It was as if, now that Ellen was with Ian, she no longer wanted to be alone in the hallway. She stayed so close to my feet that I nearly tripped over her as I reached the bottom. I was feeling uneasy. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, and had been doing so since earlier in the afternoon. That was the most rational line of thinking. I'd been clinging to that explanation ever since I had held the dissolving book in my hands. I couldn't deny what was happening anymore, though. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but there was definitely something very wrong going on. Maybe I should have tried to convince Ellen that both the book and the quick flash of the creature in Ian's bedroom were real. I didn't know how to get her to believe me, though. I probably wouldn't have believed her if the roles were reversed. Besides, even if I could convince her, it wouldn't matter. I went over to the front window and moved the curtain to look outside. The snowstorm was still raging, and the car was completely trapped in the driveway. The small amount of road that I could make out through the falling flakes looked impassable as well. We lived a good way away from any neighbors, well outside of walking distance in this kind of weather. Say that we could make it to a neighbor's house or maybe back into town. Assuming the creature, this Nighty, was real, it had quickly followed us from the mall to our house. What was stopping it from doing the same if we made a break for it? Worse yet, what if it caught up to us while we were somewhere between the house and our destination, trapping us with it in the storm? I shook my head and allowed the curtain to fall closed. We couldn't go anywhere, not until morning anyway. At least we hadn't lost power. My eyes fell on my laptop. It was sitting on a small table in the corner of the living room, its screen black, but the green power light still on. If this was happening to us, it may have happened to other people as well. I sat down at the table and pushed a button to bring the laptop out of standby mode. Bringing up the browser, typed in the name Nighty. I knew that term was going to get countless answers, so I also added in as much detail as I could to hopefully narrow those down. When I was finished, I hit the enter key and hoped that something would come up. The only thing that I got was an error message. I frowned and leaned in towards the screen. My laptop was telling me that I was no longer connected to the internet. I took my cell phone out of my pocket and found that not only did it also not have connection to Wi-Fi, there wasn't any signal at all. A glance over at the modem and its blinking red light told me that I wasn't going to be getting online with any device anytime soon. Mavis began to growl again. I jumped up from the chair so quickly that it went flying into the couch. She was standing at the far side of the room near the kitchen doorway. Her eyes were locked on something out of sight in the other room. I went over to stand beside her and looked into the kitchen. I took an immediate step backward and smacked my knee painfully into the small table next to the doorway. I barely noticed the pain as I stared at the impossibility in front of me. The kitchen was rotated. All of the counters and appliances and furniture were hanging down from the ceiling, while the fan light extended upward from the floor. It was like it had been converted into a funhouse or a twisted roadside attraction. The long curtains were gone from in front of the doors leading into the backyard. Words had been scratched into the glass, and the glass around those words were cracked in a web-like pattern. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Somewhere inside of me, I felt a spark of anger ignite. Nighty was clearly screwing with me and my family. What else could possibly be the reason for this message straight out of a Dickens novel? I paused. Why, though? What was the point? From somewhere in the house came the sound of a loud clock chime. It echoed off the walls as it counted down the time. Mavis slowly paced back and forth with her ears flat as I tried to locate the source of the noise. We didn't own a chiming clock. The chime stopped after the 11th rang out. As if on cue, I heard a door open upstairs. I turned my head towards it, but it was too dark in the hallway to make anything out. Mavis immediately ran up the stairs and disappeared into the shadows. I didn't want to follow the dog into the darkness. Both Ian and Ellen were up there somewhere, though, so it wasn't like I had much of a choice. Getting as much of a grip on myself as I could, I slowly ascended the stairs. Mavis was nowhere to be seen. At the end of the hallway, Ian's door stood halfway open. I started towards it, but before I went more than a few feet, I stopped myself and went into the bathroom instead. Flipping on the light, I opened the cabinet doors under the sink and extracted a small toolbox that we kept there for plumbing emergencies. The house was older, and those types of issues were fairly common. It was easier to keep a separate set of tools here than to go out to the garage every time something went wrong. I removed the top tray from inside the toolbox and extracted a heavy wrench from below it. I hefted it a few times before nodding to myself. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. I replaced the toolbox under the sink before returning to the hallway. Moving the last few yards to the bedroom door, I opened it the rest of the way and stepped inside. Ian was sitting on the side of his bed, looking up at a figure standing over him. It wasn't Nighty like I'd expected. Instead, it was an older woman wearing a modest dress and glowing a faint blue. I blinked my eyes in surprise. It was Violet, Ellen's mother and Ian's grandmother. Neither she nor Ian seemed to take any notice of my presence. Instead, Violet knelt down next to the boy and took his hands in hers. She regarded him with a serious expression on her face. I need you to listen closely, Ian, she said, her voice both familiar and alien. Can you do that for me? The boy nodded. Good. You know that I went away. You know that Grandma died, don't you? He sniffed loudly. Yes, Grandma. What you don't know, Ian, is that you are the reason that Grandma had to go away forever." I felt myself gasp as the air seemed to be sucked out of the room. Ian stared up at the spectral image of his grandmother in complete shock. I'd never heard anything so cruel come out of her mouth. Now, there's no point in crying," she told him as tears began to stream down from his eyes. "Big boys don't pout. Big boys take responsibility for their actions. If you had been a better grandson, Grandma wouldn't have had to leave. My only choice to get away from your insufferable whining and bitching was to reach in and make my heart stop beating." Ian sobbed loudly, and the sound roused me from whatever stupor I was in. I hurried forward and stepped between the two of them, wrapping my arms around Ian and picking him up. He clung to me as his crying shook his entire body. I turned towards the ghostly image of my dead mother-in-law and stared at her in rage. "You're not Violet," I said through clenched teeth. "You're just some leech trying to feed off my son's sadness. Get the hell out of here." The spirit looked at me wordlessly for a long moment before disappearing. I held Ian for what seemed like a long time, rubbing his back and assuring him over and over again that the woman hadn't really been his grandmother. At first it seemed like he would never calm down, but eventually his sobs began to subside and the tension started to leave his body. I felt a knot form in my throat. He'd been through so much this evening, things that no child should ever have to go through. The writing in the kitchen had warned me that we'd be haunted by 3 spirits. It was a reference to A Christmas Carol. Unlike the ones in that story, however, it was crystal clear that these spirits weren't here to bring the spirit of Christmas into our hearts. These had much more malicious intentions. I heard a scratching noise from out in the hallway. Shifting Ian's weight slightly, I left the bedroom and went towards the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the closet. I hesitated for just a moment before turning the handle. Mavis came bounding out from inside, immediately pressing herself up against my legs. There was no way that she could have got inside the closet by herself, let alone close the door behind her. Someone, or something, had shoved her in there, and it had taken place in the very short amount of time between when she had run upstairs and I had followed. That had been, 10, maybe 15 seconds? That was impossibly fast. I also should have heard the closet close. A loud click echoed through the hallway, and the door to the bedroom I shared with Ellen opened slightly. I didn't want to leave Ian alone, but I had to check on Ellen, and taking him into a potentially dangerous situation was unacceptable. I set him down on the carpet and told him to stay with Mavis. I knew that the dog would protect him with her life, and her growls and barks would warn me if something threatened them. Reassuring Ian that I would be right back, I gripped the wrench tightly and went into the bedroom. The lights were all off, and I couldn't see more than a couple of feet in front of me. I fumbled along the wall with my hand until I was able to locate the light switch and flipped it on. As I did so, the bedroom door slammed shut behind me. I barely noticed. My eyes were transfixed on what was happening on the bed. Ellen was lying face down in a pool of her own blood. Looming over her was an extremely heavy man dressed in a red shirt and red pants. His body flab stuck out from under the shirt, and the skin dripped with sweat. His entire body was covered in barbed wire that had been wrapped with Christmas lights, the red, green, and white bulbs blinking on and off in a timed pattern. The man's eyes and nose were stitched shut with the same barbed wire and lighting. His mouth was open, however, and his thick tongue sloshed around inside of it as if tasting the air. He continuously brought one thick wrapped arm down on Ellen's back. Each time he did so, the barbs cut deep into her skin before being pulled free. Without thinking, I ran forward and swung the wrench as hard as I could at the enormous man. The metal connected hard with the side of his head, and I was satisfied to hear the crunch of breaking bone. He barely flinched, however, and with surprising speed, he lifted me off of my feet and tossed me away. I hit the dresser hard and slumped to the floor. I blinked a few times before trying to shake off the sudden dizziness. I heard Ellen moan, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. She was still alive. With the amount of blood in the bed, I had thought the worst. Forcing myself back to my feet, I stumbled forward. The wrench was no longer in my hand. I didn't remember dropping it, but the impact of the dresser must have sent it flying. Wherever it ended up, I didn't see it. Before I could reach the bed, the door flew back open and Mavis came into the room. She looked back and forth between me and the grotesque man for a few moments before stepping towards me. The look on her face was sad, almost sympathetic. With the sound of flesh tearing, the top half of Mavis's body split in half. Instead of internal organs, however, the gaping wound revealed rows and rows of sharp-pointed teeth. Before I could process what I was seeing, the giant mouth wrapped itself around my leg and bit down, hundreds of points of pain flaring as I screamed. I was pulled off my feet as the beast dragged me out into the hallway. I tried to fight it off, but it ignored my struggles. Just before I passed through the doorway, I saw the fat man begin to slam his wire-wrapped arms down on Ellen's back once again. The beast got the entirety of my body out into the hallway and continued towards the stairs. Ian was sitting on the floor near his bedroom door. The glowing spirit that had taken the face of Violet was once again talking to him, her voice too quiet for me to hear. He was weeping openly, and he didn't seem to notice when the spirit slowly wrapped its fingers around his neck. I fought harder against the beast that was pulling me away from him. I dug my fingers into the floor so hard that I felt my nails pry away from the skin. Crying out his name over and over again in a desperate attempt to get his attention, I tried to kick the creature off of me so that I could go to him, but the beast was too strong and too relentless. As my body was dragged over the edge of the stairs, I screamed his name one final time before he disappeared from sight. I closed my eyes in despair. I open my eyes, and I'm kneeling in the middle of the dark living room. It's cold. The heater isn't on, and the winter storm has caused the windows to frost over. I can see my breath in the air as I pant heavily. The steam becomes less and less pronounced as I readjust to where and when I am. For a moment, the false memories remain mixed with the real ones. Part of me clings to the manufactured ones, grasping at them like a child trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. No matter how hard I try to capture them, however, it isn't long before they're gone, and all I have left is the harsh reality of truth. I want to cry. I'm too tired and sick for that, though. I'm exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally. There's nothing left of me to give. No, that's not entirely true. I can feel the sadness and the pain and the fear rise up in me as the real memories return. The feelings aren't as pronounced as they were when all of this began, but they're still there. My eyes move to the picture frame sitting on the mantel above the fireplace. There are two images inside of the frame. The first is of Ellen, smiling at the camera on a warm summer day while seated on a bench in the park. The second, the smaller one in the bottom right corner, is of a sonogram. It had seemed right to put them together in the picture frame, just as it had seemed right to bury them together after the tragic childbirth that had taken them both from me. Sometimes they still feel very close, just a drive of less than a mile to the small hill they rest in. Sometimes, in moments such as this one, they feel farther away from me than ever. There's movement behind me, and the cold air stirs. I continue to stare at the two pictures on the mantel. There are only two ways out of this. The first is to let both Ellen and Ian go, to give up my pain, grief, and begin to heal. I love them too much to do that. Love is the endless chain around my neck that the monster uses to keep me prisoner. The second way is to end this completely, to follow Ellen and Ian into whatever's waiting. I'm too much of a coward to do that. There's a sharp pain as one of the creature's claws digs into my left temple. It won't be long before there's new memories of a new horrible event. I'll be convinced that I can save my family once again, only for that hope to be pulled away from me in a never-ending cycle. The monster leans in so close that I can feel its hot, rotting breath on my neck. "Nighty night," it says.